It's really great to see all of you here today. I'm so glad that so many people came to honor Leroy, and that's what we're all about. Leroy came here in 1984 as a graduate student. He earned his PhD in 1989, went off to the University of Maryland, had a long postdoc period with Dave Allen, one of the most famous stream ecologists, worked for Trout Unlimited for a year back in DC, and he's been here since 1997. Leroy is certainly one of the world's premier stream ecologists, continuing work, as you can see, in the tropics today, and as director of GDPE over these last 8 years, during a period of really strong growth. I served as acting director when I went on sabbatical, so I learned some of the inner workings, and I really learned that Leroy is very effective at gaining a better budget for GDPE, kind of something that you don't think much about, but that we really need. So all of us owe an awful lot to Leroy. In my department, those students who work with fish and aquatic systems, Leroy's taught limnology and stream ecology for years and has many roles. One thing that Jennifer and I were talking about with Leroy is he seems to wear this orange vest and that shirt like every other day. So she saw somebody with an orange vest and she thought it was Leroy. A really distinguished scientific career. This is a recent commentary about rivers and flow. You'll probably talk about this in Science Magazine. Here's a recent one in Nature Climate Change. I know he's very proud of the trade-offs between ecology and engineering and making those decisions. One of my favorites is this paper about homogenizing the US flow regimes and its effects. But this is the paper that Leroy is most known for, a natural flow regime paradigm, we call it now. And he has an astounding record of publication and citations. I just am totally astounded at these numbers. That paper alone has garnered more than 4,500 citations, 18 papers with more than 500, 9 of those he's senior author on. His H index is greater than his age. I tried to go into Web of Science to make a map. You know how you can map the influence of this paper, and this is the message I got. We're sorry. The citation map you're trying to create contains more papers than you can handle. So this is very well known. But Leroy is also been honored widely. He's a Montfort professor, an Aldo Leopold Fellow, an ISI highly cited researcher, and in 2012 was honored as a AAAS Fellow. But he's very elusive, and one tradition here is to try to find images of Leroy from the past to, help you understand who he is. And I had to, that he doesn't like to be photographed apparently, so I did turn to one of his former grad students, really amazing guy, Julian Olden at the University of Washington now. They spent some time in Australia. This is an Australian lunkfish. It's a fish that has not changed in the last 100 million years. It's so primitive. As fish biologists, you think about, and biologists think about size really mattering, but I guess Leroy wasn't so successful because he ended up only with this one. It is true that he can at least hold other people's lungfish with some help. And I know that recently he's worked in the tropics. Here's Cam and Leroy. He's able to carry other people's gear falling behind. But I did find this picture that Leroy indeed can sample aquatic invertebrates. So this is out there on the web. And lastly, then, you can really only understand a person by looking into their past. And so I sought some of these older photos. Here's the young, dashing, handsome Leroy Poff, probably soon after he came to CSU. He's a real out-of-the-box thinker, and that shows in his papers, but I think this might have been an out-of-the-box day of thinking you could canoe down the Yampa River. This was a trip as a grad student with Boris. Is Boris here? Kondratiev? Boris Kondratiev and Henry Zimmerman and Neil Voles. But this, to finish, this is really my favorite. This is from the old days. This was in James Ward's lab, where Leroy did his PhD. Ward, one of the most famous stream ecologists. This is Russ Rader at BYU now, and Neil Voles at St. Cloud State. But here's my favorite because it includes not only Leroy, but Rose. His wife is here somewhere, right? Where's Rose? There's Rose. I think this is, Rose also worked in that lab. So please help me welcome Leroy Poff.
Thanks so much for this honor to be able to speak to the GDPE community and the broader CSU community. I thought what I would do today is, since I was a graduate student at CSU, and back in the days when the GDP was sort of getting off the ground, I would give a perspective on my career through the eyes of a CSU student. And it's really true that so much of my career was formed while I was a student here at the university, and with the sort of burgeoning and the incipient GDPE. So I hopefully won't bore you too much with this, but certainly for the grad students, I hope there are a couple of things you can take from this as one of you, as it were. So this room used to have a nice screen that came down like this that you could actually turn around. I could see what was on there and I could point, but now, not having anticipated this, hopefully in the back you won't have to squint too hard at some of these slides, so I apologize for that in advance. Let's see if I can advance this thing. Okay, so in looking back at in looking at what I've tried to do over the years, I sort of realized that what I've really been trying to do is extract a certain level of generality from complex ecosystems and ecological processes in order to be able to make broader generalizations that can be applied in a management and a conservation context many times. So ecosystems, as we all know, are as complex as we want them to be. Managers like to make things as simple as they can get away with. And so there's a real sort of tension in between that is where I have sort of found my work over the years. So I've been fascinated my whole life with the dynamics of moving water. It goes back to when I was a kid, when I used to canoe a lot on flowing streams in the Ozarks and just poking around with rocks and being fascinated by sort of what I later came to know as the hydraulics of streams and how organisms can make their lives in that kind of complex environment and live with that on a 24/7 basis. So I read once, a couple of years ago, I decided to buy a book on TED Talks, and after reading the first chapter, I decided I could never give a TED Talk, but I could pick up on a couple of pointers, and one of which was to introduce something personal about yourself to an audience and sort of gain sympathy, and then hopefully, engender appreciation as the talk sort of wanes towards the end. So anyway, I thought I would try that, and so I grew up in a small town in northern Arkansas, and I was, really a country boy, and really loved the Ozarks and all the, the biodiversity and the landscapes. And as I said, I was very interested in streams and rivers as a kid, and so this area was actually interesting because a historical photographer, Dis Farmer, actually made a chronicle the life in this area back in the early 1900s. There's a lot of really interesting pictures of old country folk, some of whom I'm sure my relatives, in this book. But I show this picture because this fellow here holding this catfish, I remember as a kid going to my grandmother's, and just down the road there was a man, Sam Dial, who would go out fishing on the weekends with jug lines and trot lines and yo-yos, and he would have these giant fish hanging in his backyard on Sunday morning that he would clean and presumably eat, for some period afterwards. And I was very impressed by that. You can't see the fish. Fish is like this big. Oh, there it is. Oh, sorry. Okay, so I'm over here. Okay, now can you see the bridge? Okay. All right, so in the Little Red, on the Little Red River where I grew up, we used to go down to the river and swim, and it was just a really fascinating, cool place. And this bridge over the river, called Tumbling Shoals Bridge, actually is part of my family history in a way, because my great-grandparents are depicted here in a buggy crossing this bridge, and I don't even know the origins of this painting. It's been around a long time. And actually my grandfather died in an automobile trying to go over this bridge. He came down that hill and the brakes gave out, and I won't go into the gruesome details. So anyway, I have a real connection to this place, right? Well, So here's where you can start doing the math on my age, okay? So when I was in second grade, something really dramatic happened to this river. A dam was constructed on the river, and you can see here the bridges being built and the people's being drowned out. But the really fascinating thing was that John F. Kennedy came to this small town to dedicate this dam. It was his last public dedication before he was assassinated a month later. And I actually went to this dedication and saw him. The downside of this was that the river was converted into this big reservoir, and the Tumbling Shoals Bridge is now under about 50 feet of water. So I think a lot of us, sort of in my cohort, have, probably all of us in the room have some experience like this, because our landscapes in this country are changing so rapidly, and they don't seem to be slowing down. But that made a really big impression on me. I felt like I really lost something when that happened. All right, so I came to Colorado State as a grad student in 1984 after doing a variety of things that ranged from overseas living to teaching high school for a while. Short stint in med school, which I determined was not for me. I found myself in the library reading books about stream ecology when I should have been studying for biochemistry. So anyway, I ended up at CSU after a couple of years at Savannah River Ecology Lab, and here's my old picture of myself. I think it's a pretty striking resemblance, except maybe the mustache is a little bit less kempt in that photo. They used to use IDs were your social security number, so I had to block that out. I came and worked with Professor James Ward, who had done a lot of work on regulated rivers, and he told me when I came, he said, you can work on anything you want as long as it's a regulated river. Well, this was a bit of a challenge because in those days, it was the days of basic ecology. Okay, applied ecology was really sort of something to be shunned. And I generated this little graph down here at the bottom once about 10 years ago that simply shows the red line is the increase in applied ecology citations starting in the late in the 90s, mostly with Jane Lubchenco's social contract, I expect. So there's nothing in the 80s. I mean, there's no applied ecology. So, working on applied ecology as a grad student in the 80s was potentially a career issue, okay? So I did have to work on a regulated river, so I decided after a year of contemplating, I picked a site below Lake Granby on the upper Colorado River, and this shows where the site's located. And the intriguing, and I'm going to tell you about my PhD research because it's really sort of unrelated to what I do now, but I really loved it so much, but then I got sidetracked, and that's all part of the story. But, you spend 4 or 5 years as a grad student working really hard on project that you've designed, and, you can't just forget about it, okay? So the key features of this river was that it was regulated, so it's very spatially heterogeneous, okay, but also temporally stable. And this graph on the right shows the amount of the discharge moving through that river over an annual cycle, and it looks very artificial. 80 CFS is about as high as it gets. That's, you can wade across it at 80 CFS. This is the upper Colorado River, which historically would have been on the order of 2,500 CFS, in snowmelt. But this very stable system was good for experiments. And I'm going to talk very briefly about some experiments I did. So if you look under the water, this is Jeremy Monroe, a former grad student. You see on the bottom all these little case caddisflies. Can you see those from the back? All right, cool. And the cool thing about these guys is they have a little pebble case. So they glue pebbles from the stream bed together to make their case, okay? So I thought, well, I'll play with them. And so I put in some painted pebbles in the stream and took some rocks out of the stream and painted them with little grids. And I thought I'll come back 8 months from now and, do some work. So 8 months later, basically you can see the gridded rock, it's still there, but if you look carefully, you can also see that there are some self-marked caddisfly larvae. They've picked up these little pebbles and have incorporated it into their case so that they can be individually, now I could track them individually. So the question I wanted to ask was whether the movement and direction rates of these bugs reflected the the amount of flow, the direction of flow, and the algal resources that were available. So I would look through a little viewer like this and take photographs and look at the photographs later. Would measure current velocity on the stream bed, about a centimeter off the stream bed with this little meter. And then after I was done, I would pull the rock out and measure algae. Then I could make a three-dimensional surface and try to model the movement of these guys with respect to those factors. Now it helps to have good field help, and this was my former girlfriend, who's now my wife, Rose. So she helped me out in the field a few times, and I think pretty much because of that help, I got a couple of nice papers out of this work that I'm not going to talk about, just to show that this aspect of my PhD produced something. So I was very happy about that. Another set of questions I was interested in had to do again with this either physical heterogeneity or temporal dynamics of the environment, whether or not rapid increases in stream flow would cause organisms to drift off the bottom, which fishermen like to simulate that process in order to catch fish. And so I picked a bunch of mayflies here and set out some drift nets, and I basically I used a before-after control and design with, there should be 2 flow treatments, looked at drifting day and night, 4 mayfly species in 3 seasons, and I guess what I should say is, that this drift can occur either because of dislodgement, a sudden flow comes along and things get dislodged, or also to avoid predators. These bugs like to not drift, especially in the daytime, because fish will pick them off and eat them. So there's some interesting sort of evolutionary drivers here. And I picked mayflies that had different morphologies and different sizes that sort of fit into that, that sort of trade-off space, if you will. And so basically you could divide the stream with, some fencing, and then put some boards in to divert the flow to make a low flow treatment, and further downstream make a high flow treatment by diverting half the stream through the experimental reach. And basically, I'm not going to go into any of the details, but I did, had a couple of publications from that, so as far as doing my PhD, it was, I think, pretty successful. I had a couple, 4 publications off my field research. But then again, I say I don't really do work like that anymore. And part of the reason is I got diverted in grad school, and this is part of the thing I really want to point out for the grad students. And this diversion occurred sort of coincidentally with the beginning of what would become GDPE, the Program for Ecological Studies, or in Ecological Studies. And this was, a bottom-up kind of organic program that from faculty across the campus and NREL and academic departments who wanted to have sort of a more formal and rigorous ecological training. And so that started, I'm not exactly sure when it started. 83. Okay, so I got here in 84. And, the first curricular courses were Aut Ecology. Anybody know what Aut Ecology is? Oh, well, it's not important. We don't use that term anymore. It's basically sort of non-interactive ecology, like, population dynamics and individual ecology. Dave Steingraber co-taught that course. And Syn Ecology, which is, basically community ecology. And so this was a really great opportunity for me because I was in my little stream world, and now suddenly there was a bigger ecological idea floating around. And also the Distinguished Ecology series was in full force at that time, and I'm just going to put this up here so you can see some of the names of people who appeared at CSU during my tenure as a grad student. And of course, it's fabulous to have exposure to these, sort of many of these are the legends of the field, right? So it became a very dynamic environment, and partly because in the 80s there was a lot of contentious debate about community ecology. And maybe there still is, or maybe we've gone beyond that. But basically, it was a shift from the sort of idea that competition controls the structure of communities to one where the communities are more stochastically structured. Okay, and whoops. One of the people who was really involved in that controversy was John Weens, who came to CSU in 1986 as to sort of lead the PES. And John was a sort of a crusty, lovable guy, and really an inspiration, I think, to a whole generation of students at CSU. And he had helped demolish, or, well, maybe not demolish, that's too strong a word, dethrone, maybe, okay, the prevailing paradigm through a couple of papers, one he wrote in 77, and another that was in this book on the right here, Ecological Communities, where all of the nasty debates in community ecology were being laid out. So it was a pretty dynamic time. And the thing that resonated with me about John was his perspective on non-equilibrium systems and how environmental stochasticity can influence the structure of communities. And that was really resonating with me in the way I was developing intellectually at the time. And so, some of the prevailing models of the day were things like, Connell's intermediate disturbance hypothesis, where you have, diversity is arrayed along a gradient of disturbance, or Southwood's habitat template. Again, on the x-axis, you have a gradient of habitat stability, and that environmental dynamic influences the kind of biotic processes that will structure communities. And it's pretty clear that both of these kinds of models can be related to, under stable conditions, systems tend to be more competition-driven, deterministic, and under less stable conditions, more maybe stochastic. Okay, so the models tell us about what kind of structuring processes will shape, communities, but you have to know, you have to be able to quantify the environmental dynamics, okay, and you have to know where you are on that gradient, right? And it's hard to know where you're on that gradient if you're studying one location. It's usually a comparative kind of approach. So a paper that was very influential during these days was a paper by Gary Grossman, who was a Peter Moyle student and a recent new faculty at Georgia. This AMNAT paper that basically looked at 12 years of data of fish communities in the Indiana stream and showed that the biotic composition and the trophic structure were basically non-persistent. There was just turnover. And so he inferred that meant it was a stochastic processes were structuring that community, even though there was no measurement of the environmental dynamics. Okay, so a lot of this debate seemed to be driven by post hoc characterization of what the environmental dynamics were that were leading to these inferred either deterministic or stochastic communities. All right, so here's one of the main, really important point in my academic career that persists to this day was this serendipitous moment where there was a seminar in 1987. James Ward and maybe Bob Binke were leading it, and it was something wide open like topics in aquatic science. So do what you want, right? And I was all, sort of upset and obsessed with this stochastic deterministic stuff and not happy with, I wasn't clear in my mind what, was going on. So I decided to, and particularly this issue of quantifying environmental dynamics, that was something that was really bothering me. So I decided to do a project where I would develop a framework for quantifying the variability, the temporal variability or the disturbance in streams with an eye towards ecological and evolutionary implications of community, of the structure of those streams. In other words, I wanted to quantify the environmental dynamics to make predictions about what kind of ecosystems and communities we should see across a gradient of stream types. And so we all know that streams are very different from one another. This just simply shows a three-dimensional hydrograph. One stream on the left is very variable at all time scales, and the other on the right is more stable, groundwater dominated, very stable. And so if you think about a regime over time, you can characterize it in terms of, and ecologists have been doing this, evolutionary ecologists, in terms of the magnitude of events, their frequency, the duration of those events, their predictability or their timing. Those things interact with biological, those things constrain biological performance and shape the kinds of species that will be present in a given, sort of combination of those kinds of parameters. So decided to launch into my career as a big data person, and big data wasn't a term that was around at the time, and this is a pretty, sort of like an archaeological dig here, because basically what I had to do was go to the library and look at all the books, look at all the stream gauges in the U.S., there are about 2,000, read them, the description of each gauge to decide which ones were undisturbed, streams were undisturbed by dams and so forth, and basically come up with a candidate set of gauges, and then, after a lot of reading and filtering, and then, got on the telephone and called up the U.S. Geological Survey in Reston, Virginia, and said, I have a list of gauges here. I'd like to have some data on these. And they said, who do you work for? And no, not just kidding. And so anyway, then I requested some information from them. They sent it to me on tapes, magnetic tapes. Okay, I got a lot of big, exciting mail for a few weeks. Then I had my assistant in the computer lab mount those tapes so that I could download the information using Fortran. I used to be pretty good at Fortran. And extract the information from those long-term records in order to analyze those records in a way that would be ecologically informative. And I ended up with something like 78 gauges. Historical note, the magnetic tape, about 50 magnetic tapes can fit onto a thumb drive, and probably if you have a large, I did this like 5 years ago, so I'm sure 100 could fit onto a thumb drive now. So anyway, it's a very, very different world that current students live in. So anyway, that analysis led to a paper out of that seminar, which was published as I was leaving graduate school. Basically, if you think about those dimensions of variation, like frequency, magnitude, duration, timing, predictability, you can array those in like a 3-dimension. So this is the 78 gauge types. The long-term regimes are analyzed with respect to those variables, and I've just plotted them here with flood predictability on the z-axis, flood frequency on one, and flow predictability. And basically you can see, and then with the clustering routine, you can see that there are some very distinct types of streams. There are some that are more snowmelt, have a very predictable floods, and others that are very stable. They don't flood very often. They have very high flow predictability. Groundwater streams, they don't vary much. And then some out here that are intermittent, have very low flow predictability, high flood frequency. So these seem to be important differences, right? And this is the kind of thing you couldn't see unless you did a broad-scale comparative analysis. And of course, I was a naive graduate student, so I thought, why stop there? This has to solve everything, right? So I created some cool graphs that I've had fun doing, and my major professor was like, oh, okay, but basically you can see here that if you think about these sort of 3 axes, intermittency, and then flooding predictability and flood frequency, that the kinds of biological processes you would expect in these would vary depending on the combinations of these variables. So we might expect abiotic processes to dominate in a lot of those boxes. Biotic processes are probably in groundwater streams that are very stable over all time scales pretty much, okay? And then some systems more seasonally dynamic with predictable flooding, but pretty stable conditions otherwise, and maybe there's some seasonal, biotics. And the details of that aren't that important. It's just, for me, it was a way of beginning to think through the relationship between environmental dynamics and ecological pattern and process. And of course, I made made a table that, looking back at this recently, I realized that when thinking about you hear with intermittency, flood frequency, flood predictability, and so forth, and looking at a range of, I guess that's response. I can't even read it, it's so small on the screen. Yeah, so at the population level here, and at the community level here, for intermittency, flood frequency, flood predictability, flow predictability, basically a range of responses or characteristics you should see associated in that kind of system. And a lot of these are traits, the traits of organisms that would do well in a stable system versus a, versus a variable system. Things like behavioral avoidance, life history, adaptations to avoid, timely disturbances and so forth. Pretty much straight out of the ecological literature, right? But applying this to my sort of pet system, which were streams. And a system which, importantly, there were long-term data for. I mean, I think having these kinds of long-term environmental data is, for most systems, is really not possible. So they had sat there unexploited until I happily came along, and so I was glad to exploit them. So you can look around, if you look around the country, you see there are these different kinds of flow regimes. They're partly dictated by climate and by geology. They give us some expectation for the kinds of ecological processes we should see. And also, if you change the flow regime of these streams relative to their historical condition, that should induce certain kinds of ecological responses, whether that change is due to a dam or maybe to climate change. Okay, and I'll come back to that in a bit. All right, so here's a slide I didn't quite have time to make pretty. But basically, at the end of my PhD, what I sort of realized was I was working in like two different worlds. One, like on a rock, really the ecology of a place, and the other was more the ecology of places, trying to understand, how those could be linked, or maybe a little bit baffled as to how they could be linked. So, but I was also very interested in mechanisms. What are the mechanisms by which organisms perform differentially along current velocity gradients? Okay? Or what are the mechanisms by which different species get sorted into systems where they have a particular kind of disturbance regime? Okay, so another thing that I was beginning to realize is that in order to generalize, you have to simplify somewhat. And then that goes back to my earlier comment. That's a real, simplification. Some people have no tolerance for that. That's fine. But, I've always been motivated by trying to have my work be useful. And so I felt like I need to simplify responsibly, and defensively, I guess. So anyway, so this ecology of place versus the ecology of places. So really, in my postdoc, when I went off to the University of Maryland, it was an effort to try to, I was given a lot of freedom there too. I had a small grant from the Environmental Protection Agency, and I wanted to develop these ideas more completely that I really sort of stumbled on in my PhD work. And I felt like I needed to develop a framework of some kind to sort of hang all these ideas on. So during my postdoc, it was sort of, and everything pretty much after my dissertation is all around this sort of flow dynamics, okay, and trying to come up with general principles that can be used to understand patterns of nature at large scales and imply management interventions that can help sustain freshwater systems from mostly a hydrologic point of view. In working with Dave Allen, I again went into the world of big data, and it was ugly data, using large fish data sets that were very poorly quality controlled, and trying to extract data that I could test a hypothesis that came out of some of my dissertation work. Basically, in Minnesota and Wisconsin, I found 34 sites that I could characterize species composition across those sites. Could look at the hydrologic variation across those sites, and then ask, does the hydrologic characteristics explain the variation in the community structure? And basically there were, so using statistical approaches, I determined there were two types of communities in those 34 sites, 106 species or so, that could be defined in terms of characteristics that should be sensitive to stream flow. So things like morphology, trophic generalization, the size of streams they would occupy, substrate velocity. And this figure just simply shows these two community types with some characteristic species in them. And across these 34 sites, there was a whole bunch of hydrographs. And so using, again, some statistical approaches, how do you extract all that hydrologic information? Well, I used principal canonical discriminant analysis and basically generated a gradient of hydrologic flashiness, if you will, across those 34 sites from very flashy, unstable, unpredictable systems on the left over to more stable, predictable systems on the right. Then this was all represented in the hydrologic data from those 34 sites. Then the question is, do those two community types, based on traits, do they assort along that hydrologic gradient? And in fact, they do pretty well, embracing the frequentist approach with a highly significant result. So, I was very happy about that. That was a nice publication in Ecology for Dave Allen and I. The second thing I was interested in was articulating, that should read, a broader conceptual foundation for streamflow as a master variable that could really structure broadly ecological communities. And this really was a work that led to the paper Kurt mentioned earlier, the natural flow regime, where this was largely a review paper, but it was also a synthesis paper. Okay, it didn't have any new data in it, but it was collecting from the literature and from the expert knowledge of 8 or so collaborators, making an argument about why we should think about the entire range of variability as being important to aquatic ecosystems and not just something like minimum flow, which at the time from a management perspective was all that regulated rivers were asked to hold was minimum flow, and that's not going to maintain, and there's no variation among systems if you only have a minimum flow, right? Furthermore, a minimum flow is going to select against a lot of organisms that require more dynamic environments. So anyway, this byline here, the ecological integrity of river ecosystems depends on their natural dynamic character. I didn't actually write that. I'm surprised the editor was grammatically incorrect there. But anyway, that's an intuitive idea, and it's well established in the literature, and we pointed that out in this paper, and we had this little sort of cartoon diagram showing, erecting flow regime as the master variable, right? And I'll come back to that in just a moment. But one of the things I wanted to say about this paper, which was really important to me, was that it was a collaborative effort. It was my first sort of big collaborative effort. There were people from academics and NGOs, and in particular, so I was working at Trout Unlimited at the time, and Dave Allen went at American Rivers, and we had been hearing other NGOs talk about how hard it was to, like the Hydropower Reform Institute, how difficult it was to get managers, to get dam operators to operate dams in a way that was ecologically sensible. So we wrote this paper in part to create a scientifically vetted paper that could be used by NGOs and by the public at large to make a case for more environmental dynamics in rivers, not just minimum flows. And that's one of the reasons I think this paper has been so successful, is because it did reach a variety of audiences at the time when people were starting to become more empowered, from the bottom up as well. Brian Richter, whose name I've circled there, has been a long time researcher and activist at the Nature Conservancy, really good scientist, and he was involved in this. And he and I have been really close colleagues over the years, and he's done a huge amount of work in promoting sustainable river management, a lot of that around the sort of natural flow regime ideas. And the third thing that I was interested in my postdoc was how to capture sort of mechanistic understanding in models that can be predictive at landscape scales. Okay, sounds a little vague, but basically, the couple of quotes that I want to give you that I think, for me, were quite motivating. One is from the Pickett et al. Book in 1994. The most general goal of science is to generate understanding. I think we all, can appreciate that. We all want to understand how our systems work, and then the next step is to go to prediction, right? And if you understand something, you want to predict. And this quote from Orions, way back in the day, really resonated with me for a long time. A predictive science of community ecology will have to be based on underlying processes, interactions, but without dealing with all the details of those processes. And this, again, is getting at that balance between, complexity and all the details of complexity versus generalization on the other hand. So my predilections in science were to always try to think about the mechanisms, okay? So what are the mechanisms that we can characterize that are perhaps predictive but not too detailed? And so my approach was and has been to focus on species traits, okay? Because these can be mechanistically related to environmental filters or to selective forces or stressors. And in stream systems, at multiple scales is particularly important. So I came up with this little, again, a conceptual model that shows how regional species, a pool of species is filtered through a variety of filters acting at different spatial scales. And I won't go into this really too much, except to say that I think it was influenced somewhat by John Wiens in thinking about this sort of species sorting, environmental filtering in multiple scales, because he was most known for his scaling work in ecology. And so another paper resulted from that with a bunch of predictions about how different traits should be expressed at different scales, and I won't go into that. So I've continued working on traits since I was back at CSU in '97 with graduate students on invertebrates, traits of fishes with Julian Olden and his students, even traits of riparian species with Dave Merritt and others. And then also having some good colleagues here, Colleen Webb and Jennifer Hoding, thinking about more of the theoretical foundation for how traits can help us understand better community and ecosystem function. And then just some papers with students on traits. And so my general framework then has become, in thinking about how traits and hydrology might, be combined into a, more predictive framework. And this is something I presented at, when I was the president of my scientific society 10 years ago. I put together this little flow diagram, and I think, I would still stand by it largely, but basically you think about these, the hydrologic dimensions of a habitat template. There are other drivers, of course, that we have to consider, and that maybe in some cases even more important. These things occur at multiple scales. So this habitat template is this multi-driver, multi-scaled kind of environment that acts as a filter. So species that have the right traits can persist in a given template. Invasive species can also fit into that framework, if you will. Then you impose, change on the drivers from climate or dams, and basically what that gives you. If we look at like a three-dimensional template down here, we've got in that template we've got some trait space that represents traits that correspond to the three-dimensional environmental location. If we change the environment, basically we get a shift in the trait space, the trait composition at the community level. So that's sort of a general model that I've ended up working with. We parlayed that model into partly into it's a really exciting project I'm working with now with some colleagues here at CSU in Ecuador, and not pictured in this figure is Boris Kondratiev, who's also on the project. And basically, I won't bother you with this figure except to say that all those boxes that are in the yellow the big yellow box are kinds of traits, and our ideas that temperature and hydrology influence the performance of species in different environmental settings, as expressed by the traits of those species that occur there, and that we can use this kind of approach to think about sensitivity of temperate versus tropical stream fauna to climate change. Oh yeah, some grass students too. Yeah, so it's a really great project. We have a lot of people, really great people working on this project. All right, so I'm going to speed up a little bit now and finish off. So this natural flow approach has been really sort of important for me because it can be applied to, to dam management. There are lots of dams around the world, okay? 75,000 or so in the US even. There are lots of new dams being proposed, hydropower dams in the developing world, okay? 3,000 or so. And the question is, how do ecosystems coexist with dams, right? This is a really it's an important question, and it's one that people are increasingly becoming engaged by. So if you look at a pre-dam hydrograph on the left there and a post-dam, you see big changes in those attributes that I've already mentioned. Okay? Those changes have very well-known biological effects that have been cataloged and characterized. Okay? And this notion of managing dams for ecological benefit has been sort of formalized into this area that we now call environmental flows. And in 2007, I was fortunate enough to be involved in the drafting of what's called the Brisbane Declaration that came out of Brisbane, Australia, where environmental flows are now thought of as, after that convention, the quantity, timing, and quality of water flows required to sustain freshwater and estuarine ecosystems and the human livelihoods and well-being that depend on those ecosystems. So environmental flows is providing water to rivers to sustain not only the ecosystem, but also things, indigenous economies and so forth, okay? So it's a really appealing idea. The implementation is always a challenge because water is often a limiting resource, and there are a lot of voices in that debate. But a lot's been done, a lot of progress is being made on this topic, environmental flows, and because of my work in the natural flow regime, I've become very involved in that. So one of the challenges that we face is you can study the heck out of a river system like the Colorado River or the Bill Williams River and really fine-tune the environmental flow to some ecological needs that you understand the process relationships in. But on a global scale, there are rivers everywhere degrading, and we don't have enough data for rivers. So the question is, how do you take information from one river or a few rivers and extrapolate that to other rivers so that we can manage those in a way that we won't regret, down the road? And so I've been working with other scientists on that over the years. So how do you go from a local scale application of environmental flows to more of a regional standard setting approach? And a lot of that involves classification, like I developed, back in the early days. You classify systems according to their potential, and then how those systems are modified tells you how you should potentially restore them. I think probably my biggest effort, in a sort of significant effort in the last 5 years or so, has been collaborating with now 19 people in this approach, a scientific basis for setting flow standards for rivers that are unengaged or unstudied. How do you develop a sort of regional approach to trying to have some protection for rivers in terms of their flow requirements? We call this ELOHA, the Ecological Limits of Hydrological Alteration. And again, Brian Richter was very much involved in that. Dave Merritt was one of the co-authors on that paper. And it involves hydrologic modeling, understanding ecological flow relationships, and then there's a social component, right? Because we as scientists don't dictate what the river looks like. The society has to make a decision. What do we want the river to look like? Now, we as scientists have an obligation, I think, to help educate this public as to what the river needs and maybe influence how they think about what they would like to see. But there's increasingly a very strong social component in ecology generally, but particularly in the the area of environmental flows. And I know many of you are engaged in that. And so really the big threat now, I think, going forward, as is in so many areas of ecology, in terms of taking our sort of maybe partially well-distilled ideas about management and thinking about natural variability and how we use that to manage systems, whether they're forests or rivers, is of course the fact that things are changing very rapidly and we're moving outside of this sort of Holocene conditions where we have statistically well-behaved environmental cycles, and so this non-stationarity is a huge challenge for resource management. I mean, as well as just for society as a whole, right? And if we look at this, Aloha framework, these red stars indicate places where there are stationarity assumptions in the model. So this is, creating a big challenge for how, and I frankly am concerned somewhat that we've developed this, pretty articulated approach on environmental flows, but it's all, to the extent that it's grounded in stationarity, then it could, as people push back because of the cost of, implementing flow, environmental flows, this creates an opportunity to argue against the whole edifice, right? So several of us are working now thinking about how do we take environmental flows and move it into the non-stationarity world so that we, can still do good things for ecosystems. And so just think a couple of last slides here. Kurt mentioned this paper. I'm very proud of this recent work that I have done with engineers, economists, on how to think about managing river systems for both ecological and social benefits under climate uncertainty. Okay, and if you're interested in that topic, I would encourage you to read this paper. You can get it off my website or ResearchGate page. But I think, more and more we as ecologists are going to have to deal, if we're interested in management at some level, we're going to have to deal with this issue of future uncertainty, sort of deep uncertainty about, future climate states and what that means for decisions we make. How do we make this, sort of decisions that we don't regret down the line, right? And so, I don't know, I wish us luck, frankly. Okay, and we call that, of course, we give it it has to have an acronym, right? So it's EADS. If you don't remember anything from today, remember EADS. I'm just kidding. So, all right. So I think I'll just mention here is the last slide before a conclusion. I'll just let you read that for a second. It's really trying to erect a new framework for sustainability. Both the water resources community, water resources engineers, and the ecological communities, we're both undergoing rapid shifts in our paradigms. We're going from these sort of stationary ideas to non-stationarity. And think of ecosystems. We have invasive species, we have historical legacies. We no longer can afford to pretend that that our systems are pristine, that they're, that they're well behaved, that they're even not novel. And so this creates, I think, an opportunity for us as ecologists who have in some ways become maybe a little bit entrenched in some of our presumptions about the way the world works, to reach out to other groups that are historically somewhat adversarial, like the water resources community, and say, look, we're sort of all in this together, right? We need to rethink how we're going to manage these systems into the future because it has to be different than what it was. And so my goal here is to try to bring ecological thinking into the decision-making process about how to design and manage infrastructure before the infrastructure gets built. So go from an sort of an environmental impact statement approach where post hoc you say, oh, what are the impacts now that we've designed this economically optimal dam, what are the impacts, to go to rather to let's think about what the trade-offs are before we build the dam and decide, are we going to lose things in building that dam that we will later try to restore at some extravagant cost. So, all right, I would say then, okay, so Kurt took most of my time, so I'm having to rush to finish up. I guess a couple of takeaways, and one is, I've thought about this over the years, having come out of CSU, and why was I successful? How did I end up, at a university and doing, an academic job? And I never expected to be back at CSU, but that was just sort of an added bonus, really. There are like three things that, are that start with G that are required. One is good work, and everybody has to do really good work. I mean, and you have to be, serious about the work you're doing, and be, really focused on producing high quality work. And I think that's the first thing. That's the first thing for success, right? Second is, good connections and, networking with people at meetings, and, your connections to your advisor and so forth. And sometimes good connections trump good work, but probably those don't end up with tenure as much. So good work, good connections, and I think then, of course, good luck. And for me, I think the luck piece was just the serendipitous moment of having this seminar, of which, I don't know, that provided a framework for me, a structured framework to pursue something that was a bit out of the box, and that I felt strongly about there was something missing, and I'm a grad student, I'm going to solve it, right? And so I think that kind of, there are opportunities like that lurking all the time for people, and I think, so to students in particular, I would say, take advantage of those opportunities if you see them. In looking back at some of my older papers, I surprised myself at how many citations I had in those papers. And it reminded me, I did a lot of reading as a graduate student. And that was back in the day when most of the reading was actually physical papers, and it wasn't just scanning abstracts, and and there weren't as many papers, right? And you had physical journals. I think it might be harder in some ways to read deeply now. It's a lot easier to read, sort of scan things. But I think reading full papers and not ignoring methods sections is a really important thing as you've got your time in graduate school here to develop your habits and your skills for the rest of your life, and so be serious about it, and then stretch yourself and think outside the box. I think is always a good thing to do. Sometimes it works. I mean, another part of my luck was that I was interested in this hydrologic classification work. I submitted that paper to American Naturalists. I thought, yeah, Gary Grossman, got this stochastic thing, and I'm going to, put it all in context. And they said, where does this fit? So it happened. It was it was a paper that was, it was work that was sort of too much in the cracks, I guess, at some level. And I think maybe that's less of a problem now, but as we become more and more sophisticated in our subdisciplines, there are still these interfaces between subdisciplines where key work, I think that's one way to get ahead, is to focus on those interfaces and be integrative. So finally, I would just say I think you think rigorously and in an integrative fashion. I think that's, having been a GDP, director of GDP for 8 years and having seen hundreds of students, some more frequently than others, you can see the students who think rigorously and integratively, and feel like that's the model you need to follow in order to really be successful. And I guess my final closing comment would be that I really enjoyed my 8 years as a GDP director. It's been great being back at CSU for the last 19 years or so. Wonderful place to do ecology, great colleagues, very diverse set of interests. And one of the things that interested me in being the director of GDP was to get to know my colleagues better across campus. And we're a bit fragmented, siloed, even though we have an integrative, interdisciplinary program. But very impressed with the quality of and I think the reputation of this university is well deserved given the quality of individuals across campus who work in this area. And I also felt like when I took the position that, I understood what it was about, having been here, during the early days, and I felt like I could relate to the, students. I guess the problem with aging professors, you always feel like you can relate to the students, right? And at some point, you don't say that anymore, but I'm not quite there yet. So anyway, I wanted to give something back to the university because I felt like I had been given a lot through the program for ecological studies, and I was really convinced that GDP was a great program, and I think it is a great program, and we've done a lot of really great work over the last 25 almost years. So so I guess with that, I'll just thank a lot of people, and I don't know whether I've managed to leave no time for questions, but I'd be happy to entertain a question or two if Kurt so wants. Thank you.